lucky to get to know you over the last couple of years, with this material. And I don't know if I ever told you this story, Michael, but so I published Thinking About Thinking and Unidentified Flying Hyperobject simultaneously. They came out the same month. It was November of 2023. And then in January of 24, I think it was, Michael, I get this notice from the college that somebody had sent me an email through the college website. And it was someone who wanted to talk about my book. And then I saw and it just said, he wants to discuss your book. And I saw it was Michael Zimmerman. And I thought, oh my gosh, Michael Zimmerman read Thinking About Thinking, because like Heidegger's a big player in that. And I was like, Michael Zimmerman, like one of my like most admired Heidegger scholars, read my book on Heidegger. And then when I saw, oh, it's the UFO book. So and I had no idea, Michael, that was a topic for you. And probably you're someone I should have been referring to in Unidentified Flying Hyperobject. So I still feel badly about that. So anyway, so I have probably about 20-25 minutes of remarks that I prepared, and I thought maybe I would just do those, and then we can discuss, if that's okay with you, Michael. Is that good? Okay. I'll keep it fairly short on that, because I know there's no better way to bore people to tears than to read a paper to them, but we'll start there. Okay. So here we go. All right. I published Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, UFOs, Philosophy, and the End of the World in 2023, with low expectations in terms of the scope of its readership and its influence. The fact that we are here 2 years later discussing this text is something of a surprise to me. I would, however, be indulging false humility if I claim that this is an unpleasant surprise. I really do appreciate the interest that you and many other people have shown this odd little book. That being said, one of the primary lessons that I have learned since publishing Unidentified Flying Hyperobject is that speaking in the space of ufology almost assuredly puts one in the position of being misheard. Over the last couple years, I have been described as a Platonist, an advocate of UFO disclosure, a metaphysical idealist, an expert on the history of religion, and even an apologist for the Roman Catholic Church based on people's readings of Unidentified Flying Hyperobject. I am here to report to you that none of these descriptions are true of what I was out to do in that book. And in fact, some of these claims run quite contrary to the actual theses I advanced there, and even a few of my own most tightly held philosophical views. I am neither a Platonist nor an idealist in the conventional sense of those terms, though I would note that Plato himself is not a Platonist of that sort. I have no expertise in the history of religion, and whatever my own cultural commitments or faith commitments may be, or struggles therein, I do not write as an apologist for the Catholic Church. UFO disclosure is a matter of political, legal, and scientific considerations that go far beyond my meager qualifications and interests, and I studiously avoid these worries in the text. I am in no position to judge what is or is not a plausible piece of human technology, though I think we should be prepared to be surprised about that. And I am in no position to judge what information can safely be released to the public regarding our national security and the like. Certainly, I bear the primary responsibility for these misunderstandings due to the many infelicities of the book. In an earlier conversation about Unidentified Flying Hyperobject as part of a reading group here for SUAPs, a perceptive reader pointed out that the book is something of a melange that mixes some starkly contrasting apples and oranges. That criticism is well taken, and I readily admit having put a quite motley cast of philosophical characters into the drama. Even if I can see the thin red thread running through Plato, Clarke, Strieber, William James, Aristotle, Heidegger, object-oriented ontology, Timothy Morton, Nietzsche, Vallee, Gunther Anders, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, following such a complex patchwork of thinkers and ideas is a lot to ask of the reader. I am not, therefore, surprised that even sophisticated readers have had difficulties tracking any coherent path of argumentation throughout the text. To make matters worse, most of the chapters of Unidentified Flying Hyperobject had their origin as self-standing essays. and I can't say I even ever managed to fully erase the borders among them. The text is then rather episodic, which might allow someone to easily ignore certain parts at the expense of others. There is also the question of the audience for the book, which I did raise to myself as I pulled it together. What did I expect? Who did I expect would read Unidentified Flying Hyperobject? The public of non-academics interested in the UFO question? Well, the ideas and arguments at certain crucial junctures in the text go a good bit beyond what can be reasonably expected from that audience. I can't say that none of Unidentified Flying Hyperobject presupposes prior education in philosophy. At the same time I was writing, I cannot say I really expected Unidentified Flying Hyperobject would move the needle much among academic philosophers. Thus my surprise when Michael Zimmerman reached out to me. What I finally decided is that the UFO is a worthy topic of philosophical reflection. It is certainly something among Sellers' fabled things in the broadest possible sense, which should hang together in the broadest possible sense. And the discussion of this topic could use a bit more philosophically rigorous set of concepts. I thus framed the project to myself as an attempt to put some ideas into play in a region of discourse where they have previously not been employed. The hope was not, nor is it now, that my work on the UFO question would come to some widely accepted conclusion, but that the ideas that I introduced from academic philosophy would take on lives of their own after being released into ufology. Of course, that is a bit condescending toward established thinkers in that community, but I don't know how else to enter the fray. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't disingenuously playing around with concepts in Unidentified Flying Hyperobject merely to make a display of academic acumen. I stand behind its arguments that I made to the degree that certainty in those matters is possible. Nevertheless, defending a particular ontological vision of the UFO was not really the point for me when I wrote Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, nor is it now as I continue to think about this subject. So, beyond my pedagogical intent, what was the point of that book? I actually answered that question explicitly rather early in the text. In the very first lines of the introduction, I announce a theme, though maybe not a concrete thesis, that unifies the subsequent discussion. Permit me one self-quotation, quote, "This book is mostly a cautionary tale aimed at counseling humility. The UFO stretches us to and beyond the limits of what humans can comprehend. Thus, as we approach the phenomenon, we should mistrust ourselves simultaneously as we try to make sense of it," end quote. Yes, I do averse some heavy metaphysical speculations and defend some rather partisan readings of major figures in the history of philosophy. I also appeal to phenomenology and cognitive science to make a case that we should not be surprised that the world is surprising, given the basic ways human cognition and perception make their objects available to us, somewhat paradoxically, by limiting our access to the full set of their attributes. Those are exercises in ontological grounding and sense-making, which might serve as concrete proposals for building an understanding, maybe even a body of knowledge of the phenomenon. Thus, I do make a claim on how things actually stand with the world and our minds. However, this metaphysical stance comes at some expense, as it is built on a model of the mind in the world wherein humans are constantly confronting a reality that, even though it can be pragmatically managed in the narrow ranges along its margins, both completely outstrips the categories of our understanding and may, in some ways, play a role in determining our lives. In short, I argue that the UFO is just one more example of a range of phenomena, suggesting that human beings don't really know what's going on with the world or even themselves. That is the humility piece that I raised in the opening lines of the book. The apocalyptic tenor that I purposely infused throughout the text, beginning with the subtitle, was not intended as a suggestion that we are coming to the end of the world in some literally physical sense, an Armageddon led by alien invaders, as it were, but that our phenomenological world, the Lebenswelt or life world of implicit meanings that structure our everyday comportments towards things, has once again been faced with the revelation of its undoing. I see the UFO as something akin to Freud's three great insults to human narcissism: the Copernican revolution of heliocentrism, Darwin's evolution by natural selection, and Freud's own revelation that the ego is not master of its own house. All of which have repeatedly reminded modern humanity that it is not the measure of what there is. Moreover, I regret that I did not spend time in Unidentified Flying Hyperobject exploring Jung's thesis that the UFO experience might be a mass-scale neurotic symptom, which he thought made sense as the Western world faced the stark anxieties of the Cold War. We certainly have renewed these same anxieties and added a few more that are maybe even equally distressing. That is, I see the UFO as apocalyptic in as much as it reveals the superficiality of our going worldviews, or it is a symptom of the expression of such anxious revelations. Either way, the phenomenon is most interesting to me as a stark clue that the world in its fullness does not necessarily answer to our needs for meaning or understanding. That is why I end the book by invoking Merleau-Ponty's claim that the revelations of psychoanalysis do us the service, even if it is initially grim work, of disabusing us of the illusion of what he calls a shameless humanism. In short, my dearest aim in Unidentified Flying Hyperobject was to use the UFO phenomenon as a way of forging another route to anti-humanism by exploring a symptom of the condition of our collective psyche over the last several decades. Note well that anti-humanism is not anti-human. The idea is not to use the UFO as a platform to deny the value of humanity, because we have some evidence that we are not on the top of the proverbial ontological food chain. Rather, the point is to see the UFO as a case of the real that always escapes human pretensions to understanding and control. There is something out there, maybe the most important thing, which perpetually escapes our symbolic and imaginary nets. To evoke the metaphor of Plato's cave, which has become rather hackneyed in this discussion, maybe partly thanks to me, there really is no getting out of the cave. Humans, because of the rudiments of our cognitive function, are inherently cave dwellers. We have to learn to live with the fact that, in the end, we always end up staring at images of our own construction, even though we have very good reasons to believe that there is an excess to our symbolic networks that necessarily resides beyond our grasps. We encounter this more than we can imagine when we encounter the uncanny, of which the UFO is a case. This is how I now tend to think about all so-called anomalous phenomena. The notion of the apocalypse of our Lebenswelt and the reminder that we cannot trust our given humanist presumptions were especially at the forefront of my intentions as I wrote the last two chapters of the book, what I called the UFO religion and our epistemic vulnerability and apocalyptic philosophizing. In the latter case, my concern was to highlight how our own technologies can take on lives of their own and thereby confront us as if alien, to borrow Tim Morton's phrase. Once we make a turn towards the grim humility that I'm advocating, we have to admit that we don't really even know what our own technological progeny are doing out there. Objects for us are always partial caricatures. And this is the claim I adopt from object-oriented ontology, though I don't take that stance wholesale. Therefore, even the things we make can be, and probably are, up to more than we can readily grasp. Our machines are likewise occasions for the uncanny. I am using technology in a very broad sense to include devices such as cell phones and automobiles, but also systemic artifacts such as industries, bureaucracies, social networks, or even languages. All of these sorts of entities originate in human contrivance in some manner or another, but then enter into broad processes of hybridization with other entities, both atomistic and systemic. Our own technologies then take on lives of their own, which we then confront as others beyond our control. Think here of notions such as Marx's capital, Lacan's notion of the symbolic big other, Heidegger's the they self, or Kierkegaard's public. These are all things that human humans bring into being through their praxis or even by pretending, but which then go on to run us as if they were subjects in their own right. The UFO might then be something like a technological system of both devices and techniques of social organization that has gone rogue like the proverbial Frankenstein's monster. And I believe we can point to one historical instance of such in the Manhattan Project. I realize that this is historically controversial, but the Manhattan Project was of such a grand scale and operated with such mechanical inexorability that it is unclear that any one human being understood it completely or had it under his or her control. The Manhattan Project ran the people taken up into its throes just as much, if not more, than they managed it. This is how I interpreted Jacques Vallee's many and often obscure pronouncements regarding the UFO. He is taking a position akin to digital technology and the internet as Oppenheimer took with respect to the development of the atomic bomb. He is announcing that our technological doings, which he himself has played a role in developing, are now on the loose and confronting us as Promethean deities that do not necessarily hold our interests in mind. It is at this point that I believe we all do well to consider the underappreciated work of Gunther Anders. I should have emphasized, to a much greater degree, the possibility that the UFO operates, whatever we make of its nuts and bolts or institutional systemic reality, in a cognitive psychological space where it has definitely developed into a sort of mimetic daemon or cultural archetype. That is, the UFO, whatever its standing as a physical entity, has psychological and therefore material effects throughout its quasi-agency. Moreover, just like any other ideological structure, the UFO does its work in ways that are beyond any particular human ability to control. Here, too, we can see this sort of suggestion in Vallee's own words, and I'll quote him at length here. Quote, "It doesn't matter anymore whether flying saucers are real or not. It still matters to me as an individual scientist. I have often stated, and I still believe today, that UFOs are real and technological. When I say that it doesn't matter whether they are real or not, I am speaking of their social impact. You can find scholars who will prove to you that the supernatural powers of Jesus Christ never existed. You can also find scholars who will prove to you that they did exist. Does it matter? Of course not. It only matters to the experts who have staked their academic reputations on either side of the argument. The effects of belief in Jesus, the impact of the doctrine based on the story of his life and death, are real enough. Socially, historically, the consequences are beyond question. I claim that the same now applies to flying saucers because enough people believe in them. Enough people believe that contact with them is possible. Enough people believe that they have secretly achieved contact," end quote. The point here is that the UFO could be something that we originally pretended into existence, and yet it might nevertheless be something that is now beyond our control and may even play a role in governing our behavior. The UFO is not unique in this way, as Vallee points out. That is just how ideas operate once they take a place of prominence in the collective psyche. To return to Vallee's example, even an extreme religious skeptic cannot deny that Christianity has managed such an important place in many cultures that it doesn't matter for many purposes whether Jesus Christ actually did the things that he is purported to have done. The figure or symbol of Jesus Christ has become an effective force all its own, because it is now part of the unconscious operating system for large swaths of humanity. Even if Jesus Christ was imagined or contrived into existence, the idea is nevertheless operative. Moreover, even those who deny the ontical existence of Jesus Christ, their inheritance of a language and culture, a symbolic network that structures their subjectivity, cannot claim independence from the effects of this idea. Likewise, Vallee points out that the UFO has achieved a level of symbolic prominence such that it is impossible to deny its efficacy. Notions taken from the UFO lore are now, or at least Vallee seems to claim, part of our unconscious symbolic structure, whether we like it or not. Really, this is a point that Diana Pasulka makes very clearly in American Cosmic, though it has mostly been ignored in the popular discussion of her work. I am struck by how closely Vallee's argument here parallels some important streams of thought in contemporary critical theory. For example, Tad DeLay makes a similar point in the idiom of Lacanian psychoanalysis when he says that, quote, the unconscious insists on repetition. The big other is non-existent, but insists with a clamoring, voracious appetite, end quote. The big other is a Lacanian term of art for the shared symbolic pact that we all unconsciously participate in by virtue of a common linguistic acquisition or maybe even imposition. The big other is the implicit subject for whom we all perform whenever we say, fine, thank you, in reply to the equally routine, how are you, every morning at the office. It is a rather odd game that we play around the office water cooler, asking indifferent questions and offering disingenuous answers. For whom do we put on this performance, and what is its point? For Lacan, the third party to our conversation is the big other. Even though we don't suppose we know what we're doing, at least not if we think it over, we suppose that somebody does. Somebody has to be in charge of all this. At least that is how we act. We can imagine ourselves, we can imagine various accounts of what is going on in these situations. And in doing so, we mediate ourselves through various self-images. But in the end, we follow the system of our common symbolic pact and enter into the game of polite banter. I might imagine myself as a kind and solicitous fellow, and therefore always reply to "How are you?" in the right way. Pardon me. Likewise, even if I am a cynic who sees these practices as vapid, when somebody says "Good morning," I'll likewise reply in kind. The point is that one can come to the conclusion that big other doesn't exist. That is, our social practices are something that we pretend into reality, and yet she is no less beholden to these symbolic demands. Obedience to the big other is the price of speaking a language. We were all told at one point that if we want the little others in our vicinity to help us get what we desire, or even to help us know what we are supposed to desire, then there are certain rules of the game that must be obeyed. We, like everybody else, must act as the big other requires, otherwise we will be left out in the cold. Notice that the big other doesn't govern us consciously. I don't make a conscious decision about the required reply of fine, thank you, and nobody ever sat me down to explain the game. Thus, it's not up to my conscious sense, my imaginary register, as to whether I will play by the big other's rules. That has all been set for me. Even if I realize the big other doesn't exist, I accept that we pretend it into being, it still insists on its demands, and we follow suit. The idea here is that a structure of belief can be a social artifact, and yet it nevertheless is not within our conscious control or even purview. As Slavoj Žižek puts it, quote, the big other is a totally subjectivized substance, not a thing in itself, but a substance which exists only insofar as it is continuously sustained by the work of all and everyone. Thus, this, however, is exactly what This, however, is exactly the Lacanian big other. It is definitely not mental. It does not belong to the order of the subject experience, but it is also the pre-symbolic, but is not also the pre-symbolic material real, a thing or a process in reality independent of subjectivity. The status of the big other is purely virtual, as an internal structure of reference. That is, it exists as the subject's presupposition, end quote. Note that final remark by Žižek regarding the subject's presupposition. His point is that the big other is an unconscious condition for all of our intelligible thought and action. We simply need the symbolic pact to get ourselves off the ground, and none of us gets the final vote in the symbolism by which we operate. The big other is the structure of the unconscious. The symbolic order is not something we experience directly. It always has to be read through interpretation of the imaginary. Nor is it something we encounter in the real. In fact, the big other cuts us off from the real. Once again, humans are cave dwellers, and that is the expense of our fabulous social technologies. The game of etiquette around the water cooler is easy to poke fun at, But Lacanians like Zizek argue that this is the model for how ideology works. Quote, ideology is not simply an illusory representation of reality. Rather, ideology is a social reality whose very existence implies non-knowledge of its participants as its essence, end quote. The point here is that the fundamental ideological content of our thoughts and utterances is not necessarily within our conscious purview. Ideology works precisely because we do not consciously know all that we are really up to in what we say and do. We might overtly deny X and instead claim to believe Y, and yet when seen from the structural perspective, this supposed change of semantic commitment is really a reimagining of a stable symbolic content operating in our unconscious psychical background. I can imagine all sorts of claims about my newly gained commitments contrary to the dominant ideology, but when observed in the proper way, I will mostly be revealed as simply inserting new imaginary descriptions into the same structural system. To reverse the New Testament analogy, we are usually just putting old wine into new wineskins. Notice how the unconscious operation of ideology through the big other leaves us ripe for all sorts of manipulations, for we don't really know what we are up to. We can see the insistence of the big other in a lot of the discussions about the UFO, at least in the popular literature. In this milieu, one finds much talk of ontological shock. But I find many of these reports to be not terribly shocking at all on an ontological level. That is not to say that in an encounter with a manted being or an internal examination by gray aliens, utterly devoid of signs of empathy, would not be traumatizing. I doubt neither the unpleasantness of such episodes nor the earnestness with which many of them are reported. And I also believe that many of these reports point to actual events of some sort. Moreover, such encounters are usually entirely unexpected given one's prior experiences, and they thereby may lead their subjects to question a great deal of what they previously trusted about the world. Consider what it would be like to encounter a previously unknown and exotic species of predatory reptile, or being kidnapped by a clandestine criminal cabal for the purposes of harvesting one's organs. Both events would likely produce starkly novel experiences that carry life-altering consequences. Would we say, however, that an encounter with a three-headed monitor in the basement or a debasing kidnapping incident were ontologically shocking? No doubt these events would change things. They would give us new information, even information that would leave us wary in previously comfortable situations, but I doubt that they would force a revision of our ontology. Realizing that there are three-headed monitors or organ harvesting criminal gangs on the loose would change what I imagine to be the concrete possibilities of what might wait around the corner. But such threats would not alter the implicit structure of my understanding of the world. These possibilities are novel, but they are still squarely within our going imaginary register. The categories of reptile and criminal cabal would be expanded, but it is not to put the entire system of ontological categorization under suspicion. As some philosophers put it, these experiences might force an ontical, but not an ontological change in one's bearing toward the world. Likewise, we should analyze the ontological gravity of the experiencer reports in a similar manner. Encounters with manted beings and alien abductions force us to imagine different concrete possibilities, but they do not change things at the most fundamental level of ontology. Whether we are ruled by an elite class of billionaires or the reptilian overlords of conspiratorial lore doesn't matter structurally. These are the same accounts of things implicitly, even though they imagine the underlying ontology differently. No doubt. There is an ontological difference between the two accounts, but it isn't, there's an ontical difference between the two accounts, but it isn't ontological. They both interpret the world in terms of predation and deception. They both posit dastardly agencies running everything from behind the curtain. The two different imaginings are alike in what they take as the meaning of being. There's a real difference between my organs being harvested by drug cartels and biopsies by gray aliens, but these two stories have the same implicit ontological structure. If it turned out that what we had all along imagined to be nefarious if it turned out that what we had long imagined to be the nefarious work of criminal gangs exploiting a black market for biological goods is really the doing of gray aliens managing their human livestock, that would be a significant datum, but it is not a rethinking of the world at its most basic level of meaning and significance. The world would still be the same kind of place, an arena of exploitation and violation, even though we would have to imagine it as being populated with new entities, while also entertaining new possibilities for what the future may hold. Such a revelation, though practically important, is a movement within our going ontology. It's not a wholesale revision of what we might have thought to be what it means to be. Gray aliens and manted beings, abductions and otherworldly craft, etc., are well within our standard ontological framings, even if they force us to imagine new ontical possibilities. Again, none of this is to question the legitimacy of or significance of people's experiences, but only to call into question the use of the term ontological shock to describe these consequences. I am suggesting the fundamental ontology operates much like the ideological big other. We do not encounter our most important ontological understandings from within our conscious imaginary register, and therefore changes at the latter level can mask stasis at the former level. What is now often called ontological shock may well be a way of clinging to an underlying ontological category by allowing for a change in the imaginary register that leaves our fundamental interpretation of being unmoved. That is not to say an experiencer hasn't had a run-in with something truly abysmal, an encounter with a reality that shakes her sense of being able to make sense of reality at all. My point is to suggest that we be vigilant as we consider any identifications made regarding the entities appearing in such experiences. In particular, we should be wary of a human tendency to reimagine the same structural position in an implicit ontology as a way of conserving the scheme of things. Are we avoiding the consequences of the ontological abyss by recasting an uncategorizable encounter within the flexible categories of the imagination, so as to preserve our self-confidence as arbiters of what there is? This is not to mistrust the experiencer, but to recognize the all-too-human tendency to conserve our cognitive lifelines. Our obeisance to the big other is all we have to go on, so we will only give it up dearly. Renouncing the basic rules to the only game we know how to play is not something our psyche is apt to do willingly. Maybe all there is in the phenomenon is something akin to the discovery of a new species of reptile or a previously unknown criminal enterprise, which of course would not be a small discovery. But we will never know whether there is something truly abysmal, a bona fide ontological shock to our symbolic system, unless we are attuned to how our own imaginal plasticity might be working to protect us from confronting that very sort of admission. Our dearly cherished principles of sense-making could constitute the most intractable obstacle standing between us and what might be intrinsically nonsensical reality. Again, I am not dismissing anyone's claims to have had certain experiences that are truly uncanny or beyond the pale of our common ontological ideological structure. In fact, the Lacanian approach I am following here entails that there is always an excess beyond our imaginary symbolic structured experience. The symbolic works by cutting us off from something, and that being ever eludes our imaginative and sense-making endeavors, even if it constantly fuels our repetition of these ill-fated attempts at understanding. The repressed always returns, and I believe it does so ubiquitously. Moreover, we have to remember that any articulable ontological or metaphysical categorization of the real presupposes the symbolic dominance of the big other. We can only speak of what is real in terms of our common system of signification. Thus, in a way, the real, taken as we can articulate it, is formed retroactively by the symbolic. Thus, we cannot penetrate the real as it is independently of the symbolic. We are stuck here in the repressive structure on which we depend. We thus live in a sort of mundane uncanniness. Our ordinary way of being in the world leaves us confronted by an irreducible excess, which we can only encounter as absence or negative excess. There seems to be something missing in all our stories about things. This is what Zizek means by less than nothing. Sometimes the uncanny is far from mundane. Some people run into something that is more than a sneaking suspicion of what is lacking in the ordinary. And in fact, they see something that simply does not fit. I have no doubt of all that. And I am perfectly open to the notion that the UFO is just such an experience of the extraordinary uncanny. My point, however, is that we cannot simply give our unconscious a pass in these matters. That is, the study of the UFO, or the UAP, needs to be submitted to the rigors of critical theory. We need to get to the bottom of what invests us in this particular phenomenon as a libidinal and ideological level before we can trust ourselves with its analysis and verification. Otherwise, we run the risk of merely rehearsing yet another repetition of the same symbolic structures that have long operated as our big other, even if they have taken on new imaginary masks. This is the point I tried to make in Chapter 6 of Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, where I began by invoking Nietzsche's opening lines to the genealogy morals. Quoting Nietzsche, "We knowers are unknown to ourselves, and for good reasons. How can we ever hope to find what we have never looked for? The sad truth is that we are necessarily strangers to ourselves. We don't understand our substance. We must mistake ourselves. The axiom, each man is farthest from himself, will hold for us to all eternity. Of ourselves, we are not knowers." End quote. Of course, Nietzsche is correct that we cannot get to the bottom of ourselves, and therefore we cannot get to the ultimate real. Our own unconscious will at some point get in the way. Once again, the human mind makes the world available by ignoring or repressing much of it. Thus, I am not claiming that we can achieve some enlightened world picture if only we began with adequate self-analysis. Rather, my claim is that until we attune ourselves to the possibility or even inevitability of our being undermined by our unconscious ideological structures, we will be victimized by our own ignorance of our limitations. We need to mistrust our attempts to identify the phenomenon of the uncanny. For example, it's a flying saucer, it's an angel, it's an extra-dimensional time traveler, until we have girded ourselves against our investments in all of these images. This is part of the work of the humanities and ufology. Up until now, humanities scholars have mostly made contributions to the field via legitimating, comparative, and phenomenological discourses. By legitimating, I have in mind those thinkers who have done the good work of showing how ubiquitous the experience of the uncanny is and how resistant it is to conventional explanations. By comparative, I'm referring to those scholars who have drawn the analogy between UFO experiences and historically significant religious and otherwise uncanny experiences. By phenomenological, I'm referring to those, and Kim Engels, who's a member of this organization, comes to mind here, who are attempting to take the UFO experience seriously and making a careful account of the actual structures of the experience of the uncanny. Those are all worthy and quite necessary endeavors, along with the continued discipline natural scientific investigations of the phenomena. I only want to add that we also need this further critical, even psychoanalytic mode of investigation in order to separate what is just us from the real in the uncanny. Of course, there is no dearth of critical theory that takes the UFO as a cultural phenomenon. What is needed, however, is a critical theory that is open to the UFO as expression of the unspeakable real. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Great. Now I'm lost in contemplation. Yeah, so I guess what we should do is, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna say one or two things, and then I'm gonna hand it right over to Michael. I just wanted to just put a pin in, and then I can come back later as part of the audience. You know, I circulated this document, I think, to you, arguing for the introduction of the problematic of difference into this whole discussion. And I just want to link that to the further critique of the Lacanian concept of the real. Because in Zizek, at least the last time I kind of tuned in, and I participated in these seminars with him, and at that time, he characterized the ultimate problem in philosophy for us who adopt this tradition is the transcendental horizon. And it seems to me that the real, even in critical theory, there is this ultimate level of this represented reality, this ultimate point at which we the concepts that with which we used to orient ourselves comes up against this insistence, this something, the Ding an sich, and it, Lacan structures it in terms of the big other, and this is the ultimate, like the uber determinant of our critical theories, in a sense, that we've come up against this real, right? What is this, right? But it seems that there's this alternative line that was not explored that circumvents the Hegelian tradition, the problem of representation, following from the Kantian attempt to surpass the traditional structure of thought from the rationalists, right, and so on, to try to understand what is the true nature of reality, and so this is the thing that in a sense is the ultimate level of critique, right? This notion of a representation of a real, and I just want to put a pin on that. There's something to say about that, and I think maybe there's a way of answering the problem that you pose, which is, so how do we get to that level of ontological shock? If it's always just ontical shifts that always re-articulate the familiar, so then what does it take, to get to that actual shock, that fracture, And then, anyways, I just wanted to say that. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael. Thank you again, James. Amazing.
Real quick, just like a pin. Since this is kind of inside baseball for Mike and me, since our last conversation, Mike, I just plowed through difference and repetition. I mean, just plowed through it, and I'm like, this dude just ruined everything for me.
Yeah,
in the best way, in the absolute best way. So, and
when
I was writing these comments, I purposely said, "Don't talk about Deleuze, Jim, because it's it's another thing that's got to be done."
Exactly. It's one of these underutilized resources, I think, for us, but it requires a lot of fleshing out. Anyway, so we'll put a pin on that one, and then I'm gonna transfer that over to Michael. Michael, I think you're still muted. So if you have any remarks.
Well, first of all, I'm gonna put a pin in the Deleuze references. So if you figure out what he's talking about, just text, all right, and I'll. He's a little above my pay grade, and I'm hoping to. But I know it's important. But anyway, let me just say this. I thought this was a terrific book. I had so much fun reading it, and felt like I was in a philosophy course, because what I would not call what you were doing a mélange. I would call it an instance of bricolage, as Levi Strauss spoke about it. And what is bricolage? It's the repairing or trying to construct something out of what's at hand. In other words, you can't go to the Home Depot because it's closed. So you got to repair something given what you have. And what you have in hand is a history of philosophy, as well as recent psychoanalysis and Lacan and all this. And so it was really interesting, step by step, the whole process. The reference to the cave, and also something that I've been rereading, that Myth of the Cave. It's all about violence. It's about trauma, about the forced turning around of the prisoner. So he has to see that I'm in a freaking movie. I'm in a movie theater. We got a film going on, projected up here. I'm thinking that's what's real. And then it gets worse. I'm now being dragged up out of the theater. I'm not wanting to do this. And now I'm confronted with it. There's a surface. I'm outside. If any of you have ever gone out of a theater or a bar at 3 in the afternoon or 4 in the afternoon and struck by the sunlight, surely Plato was referring to that experience. You'll know how you can't make sense of anything. But one thing I would stress about the cave metaphor, if you will, is the trauma trauma is required to see beyond, a little beyond what you're used to. This is the whole point of these long meditation retreats. You're put into a traumatic situation, but you're not in danger. In a way, it's kind of analogous to the experience of the sublime for Kant. You are witnessing a titanic, let's say, meteorological event or a comet or what, something that is so fantastically complex and gigantic. Kant says you can't bring it under a concept. That means you can't figure it out. You don't know how to represent it. But nevertheless, you have this extraordinary revelation of that which surpasses all of your cognitive equipment and tools. And that's in a way analogous to what happens in these long meditation retreats. And I've been there. You cannot escape it. You cannot escape the trauma. I know in the Zen retreats I've been in, if you move, you might as well go home. And that means you have to deal with the trauma of extreme pain that is yet not dangerous. And the trauma, the pain is the gateway to all the insights you get from meditation. And including the deconstruction of your ego right in front of your eyes while you're sitting there. So I just want to emphasize that. Now, that's where I think the trauma of something like alien abduction may create a kind of circumstance where it's not that you can understand the meaning or significance of it, but the shattering of the worldview. I think this is what meant by John Mack had in mind by ontological shock. It's not the difference so much between ontological and ontical, although I like that distinction you made. What he had in mind, and I think Jeff Kripal in his essay about it, is the destruction of the worldview, a temporary breaking down of it, and that is anthropocentric humanism. The assumption that we are on top of the cosmic food chain, that we're the only source of meaning and purpose. Now, especially in a secular world, this means that we own everything, and that there are no limits to what we can do to things, and there's nothing we're going to allow to stay hidden, etc. This is one of the things that Heidegger was really concerned about. I'll give you two examples. First, in 1966, he says he was horrified by images taken by a Soviet satellite of the dark side of the moon. And I tell you, when I saw those photos, I said, man, that is really creepy because it's so different from the side we see. And why should it be so different? I mean, it could raise all kind of conspiracy theories, right, folks? Is the moon a satellite? Anyway. The other thing he really didn't like and horrified by was time-lapse photography. For example, of a flower opening up its petals. He regarded it as a kind of pornography. These things are not supposed to be seen. But modern technoscience is completely shameless about the extent of going all the way down until everything is revealed. There are no secrets, and therefore nothing has any meaning except more power. That's what life becomes about. And that quote from Nietzsche you gave is really important, I think. So the ontological shock, as I've understood it from experiences I've spoken to and so on, it's really about the destruction of their meaning of their lives. Who I am is no longer who I thought I was. And for most people, who their identity, their sense of self, is their being. And the destruction of that, the pulling of the rug out from under that, especially in a world where we're told that the U.S. Air Force is in charge of everything, and there are no UFOs and no alien abductions, everything, nothing you see here, folks, and yet you yourself are undergoing an experience which is so shocking. You can hardly, these people reports, you can hardly take one step in front of the other for a while because nothing seems to make any sense after this. So I would say that, and you do a good job of maintaining the traumatic nature of it, but I would say there is a worldview nature of it that has an ontological component, if you will. And I suspect you don't really even disagree with it. Although I do think that your use of Lacan is really important. And your reference to Nietzsche and Deleuze does this kind of thing, I know too. And that is how trapped we are within the prison house of language. I think this is Foucault uses this term, but others have spoken in the same way. We just can't seem to get outside of it. Now, we live in Foucault used this concept of the episteme. You know, there's certain regimes, epistemological / metaphysical, that govern epochs. And ours is the one Heidegger spoke of, the technological episteme. Everything shows up for us as raw material that's usable for enhancing human power. Human power, and this is a point that the underappreciated philosopher mentioned Gunter Andres made clear in the 50s. He was way ahead of his time about this stuff. And that is that we're not in control of the things we create. And this becomes increasingly evident. He has this whole description of phenomenon of shame in front of the technological objects. I mean, they are perfect and we're imperfect. You know, a machine breaks down, it's shocking, but you can fix it. We break down, that's it. And I would like to add one point to this. And I've been reading a fantastic new book, More Everything Forever, by a PhD astronomer, astrophysicist who's now a journalist. It's all about contemporary AI and what is going on behind the scenes. These people want to create immortal beings and also want to create basically a new God. I'm not making this up. This all comes out of, you can read Ray Kurzweil, you can read Elon Musk, you can read Bezos and all these people. Their vision is so beyond anything ordinary folks could ever have imagined, except I think in science fiction theaters, seeing movies, that it's extraordinary. So here's the key to take away from Heidegger about the will to power at work in modern technoscience. Every stage we reach becomes a platform for achieving the next stage of power expansion. This means that the will to power is a will to constant will. It's a never-ending process that is extraordinary, and we're all wrapped up in it without any way to get out, especially with the way in which media have now become totally creatures of media. And I feel for our children and for what is about to come, including extraordinary devastation in terms of employment. So much for STEM, folks. You might as well have majored in philosophy and have more fun. Now, I wanted to say there's one other thing that I wanted to mention. I loved everything you say in here. And that is the question of pretending UFOs into existence. All right, that's, now I'm not sure what to think about that. I think there's a lot of power in that. This is what you can find this discourse in the book that John Mack recommended to me, what is it about the daimonic? What's his name? I'll think of the book in a minute.
Patrick Loper.
Yeah, Patrick Harpur. Right. What was it? Remember the title?
I think it's Daimonic Reality, or
yeah, that's what it is. Daimonic Reality, not demonic, but daimonic. Daimon was a supernatural power that could go either way. It was not necessarily good or bad. It's powerful psychological phenomenon, and to some extent, you could argue, and this is, I think, in a way what perhaps Jim's getting at, and Vallee, the UFO phenomenon is a manifestation of our own need to get back in touch with what's so. We're so wrapped up, and this is Carl Jung, right, also speaking this way, the return of the repressed. Now, one of the things that Patrick Harpur mentioned in that book is that we are so freaking repressed. The repression is so great that it takes alien abduction to actually shake people up a little bit. I mean, it's not enough X, Y, and Z, not to have just lights in the sky and doing weird things. Oh yeah, it's okay, but you have to go the whole hog. Alien abduction, hybridization, the whole sequence. Maybe is that what it takes? Now, and I don't know. Here's my question. Or another question I have in regard to the whole UFO phenomenon. If it's a control project, A control structure, as Vallee suggests and others suggest, I mean, it's very appealing to me, although who knows, right? But if you study the alien abduction literature, as well as the abduction, the literature from the early contactees in the 1950s, it's a lot about nuclear war, about avoiding nuclear war. And really, you know, in the early 80s, you know, when I was teaching at Tulane and so on, the anxiety about nuclear war had reached a almost unimaginable level. I was surprised people could even go up and go to work. I mean, it was a hair trigger moment. It was just an incredible time. So it's no wonder that you could say that what we're hearing from those who contact us, you might say, a return of the repressed, is this is what you should be concerned about. This is us speaking to ourselves through intermediaries, you know, aliens showing up from outer space or whatever. Is that what it takes for us to wake up? Now, here we are in 2025. All right. I look back, those abductions phenomena were really big, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Then they go away, as our friend Greg Agigian pointed out in his recent essay about, have you seen that one about alien abduction? Where did it go? A terrific essay. And that's my question. In fact, I've been talking to Karen Austin at the John Mack Center at Rice. It's time for a retrospective set of interviews of those people who work with John Mack. What happened to those revelations about nuclear war? The images you were shown about environmental destruction. How have those continued, if they have, to play out in your life? And is there a single shred of evidence that any of it made any difference? Therefore, what has it been all about? Did the control structure fail? Or was there one? In other words, I think that we're at an interesting retrospective moment now that we've got a generation or more, because there's between all this heyday of alien abduction, and now there are far fewer of them reported. So what was that all about? And therefore, what work has the UFO done in terms of enhancing our appreciation of the fact that the way we see things, the technological way, human control, but really also the ones being controlled, has allowed any shift there? Are we just going deeper and deeper into the soup? Are we at that transitional moment where there's no return, when our very capacity to think is being undermined by AI? And Jim, you're a college teacher still. I didn't have to go through this. I retired 10 years ago, but I use AI. I use ChatGPT. It's incredible the stuff that it can do. Difficult philosophical questions, and I keep posing new parameters and say, what about X, Y, and Z? Then it generates a whole paper, gives its own title, lays it out there, and includes really sophisticated comments drawn from Heidegger and Nietzsche scholars and so on. I'm sitting there saying, man, why is there going to continue to be college? Why are you going to spend $100,000 a year to send your kid to college? So the college is about what? Teaching people to think about difficult concepts where you actually have to do the work and come up with some kind of document that you wrote that demonstrates that you've kind of grappled with things. Now, if you don't have to do that, and there's no incentive, since you can get it, wholesale, right, cheap from ChatGPT, what will be the incentive to think? Have we seen the last generation of people who've experienced that process? And wrap it all up with social media and TikTok, where there's no capacity for sustained thought, and reading a book seems it's complicated as sending a person to the moon. Then you can see we're really in a difficult situation. So I'm just going to say that's all. That's some of the things I got, and I loved your book, and I'm working on one too, but it's hard to get beyond your book. So thank you for your good work.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. That proposal you made in terms of like following up with where are the abductee experiencers from the 60s and 70s today? And I really like that idea of, okay, now empirically, what were the actual effects wrought by that? Like, did this have a cultural effect, right? Did it make a difference? And I would even add another wrinkle to that. And this is kind of getting at what I was getting at with the need for a critical psychoanalytic approach to a lot of this. What was the real message of those deliverances once we understand, like, the conscious story might not be the real story of it? Like, what's the between the line of those messages? What's the underlying hermeneutic there? Because that would have to be done, I think, first before we could even begin to track it, right? So I think you've really proposed a very important social scientific critical kind of research that would have to be done. Yeah.
Let's take that to Trump's current ideological regime and see if they'd fund it.
Yeah, I don't know, but maybe Michael can come up with someone at some point here at SUAF. But that's exactly the sort of thing that needs to be done. And another thing too, I want to be careful because I know you weren't making this error, but what I want to make clear when I'm talking about pretending things into existence, my point is not to say we've merely dreamt up the UFO, okay? But it's to say, look, we do know human beings are able to pretend things into existence that we then experience as controlling others, right? That's how ideology works. That's how all these mimetic things work. And once we know that, then there's a layer of analysis we have to have when we approach something like the UFO. And I think that's what Vallee's point is too, in that quotation I offered from him, is like he says in the very quotation, like, look, I'm not saying there's no nuts and bolts thing, and there's no spiritual entity that's being encountered, but the point is we do know that humans have this gear to create they-selves, big others that we encounter as if they weren't us. So we have to like analyze that, peel that layer back to get to what is, and I think this is Michael Safoni's point, what is the pre-representational real that's there? But we've got to do that, like, kind of grim self-analysis first before we can get to that point, right?
Well, let me maybe make one point connected with this. And that is this. Just one point. And that, please read the Fourth Wall Phantasms, the Fourth Wall, I forget the term, by Joshua Cutchin. He's a guy who's been writing these fantastic books. And the point he's making here is that to what extent, turn this on. To what extent is reality malleable by mind? And this, I think this is really important. The extent to which our narratives actually allow for phenomena to show up that have a status which is seemingly independent, but we can't really explain how it's possible. This gets into all these strange anomalous phenomena, right? Everything from Bigfoot to UFOs. These are reported for thousands of years. No one has an account of these, and there's no Bigfoot skeleton. There's no corpse. And we don't have the flying saucer there in front of us. This is the trickster part of the whole thing. You never quite can nail any of this down. So it's as if we live in a strange world that is so different from our taken for granted, comfortable understanding of things, that it's little wonder people would prefer living in the cave than going out there and finding out what's really going on. It's too terrifying. All right, that's it.
Well, Michael, think of, Stimmung and Heidegger, mood.
Right.
I mean, like, an example I always like to use is, like, the fact that I love my wife attunes me to realities about her that one would not see were they not amorous in that way, right? Or, when you're angry, you notice things. And those things you notice are really there, but you would not have noticed them were you not angry, right? And I often wonder if some people see things that others don't, or we see things as a generation others don't because we're in the mood. I think that's kind of the Heideggerian
That's
point
a good
there.
point.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
As we just can come back to that question, Jim and Michael, about the question of the real, right? And the extent to which it is possible to situate the UFO experience within the parameters of some system of explanation. I'm going to say that in general. Okay, it could be science, it could be, pick your system of explanation. So the first, just coming back to your book, I mean, I want to really focus on what you're sort of saying. It seems to me that there are, right, a number of layers that through the various authors and philosophers you refer to, it seems that you're sort of trying to, I think, to characterize the layered nature of the experience, while making sure that we have a critical apparatus in place to be able to deconstruct the kinds of repetitions that we draw on that kind of might appear to be, to be meaningful or to be ontologically, that might appear, right, to have this kind of quality of radicalism or whatever it is, but in fact it's just a repetition of something that's actually very mundane, in a sense, a very familiar repetition of the way that the world works, and it is, and it doesn't really get us out of this, right? So that question, I guess, is sort of limited, right, to the extent to which we approach the question of the UFO from the point of view of the witness experience and the narratives that are spun from the experience, right? And what you make clear is that analysis can happen independently of the question as to what the UFO actually or really is, and put those in quotes. We have to flesh that out. And then there's this question of, to what extent do our, do these categories that we repeat, that we frame the UFO as a material craft or an extraterrestrial vehicle or as an angel or whatever, to what extent does that inhibit the critical task of trying to understand and explain the UFO in terms of the phenomenon itself, right? And I guess the complication there is that even in science, we're always sort of representing, right? We're always drawing on some kind of framing. In other words, there's always some kind of a layer, I would call it a metaphysical layer, that is presupposed, with which we use to structure the phenomena in order to gain access to it empirically. So the challenge with the UFO is, of course, there really is, in terms of empirical evidence that isn't primarily witness-based, that's a challenge. And that's a challenge that in the contemporary sort of turn towards the empirical sciences is being addressed, right? And the question is, to what extent will the UFO answer to those methodologies, right? But if we confine ourselves, right, to the witness experience and the narratives, then I guess the question is, to what extent does that have evidential import for the actual UFO? And I think when you look at this whole movement of the experiencer, there is this sort of drive, this push to treat the human experience of the phenomenon as evidential. But that's sort of the problem, right? That in a way that you're raising is that that there is this sort of layering of the experience in terms of certain ideological structures that complicate the treatment of experiencers as providing some kind of evidence for the phenomenon.
100%.
Right, 100%. For the reality of, so that's like a critical, I think that's like, that's a critical piece of your text. And again, as to the empirical resolution of the phenomenon, your analysis and this kind of a critical analysis could proceed independently of that question to some extent. But then there's this harder question of, well, even in science, we always have to deal with some kind of a critical, some kind of a framing question that does complicate any straightforward access to the phenomenon. So I just wanted to kind of just set that up and then let you kind of play in that sandbox. That's point number one. Point number two, and then I'll stop, I promise. The UFO, I think this is another aspect of the book that's really amazing, right? Which is that, once we kind of deal with all of the critique of the narrative of the experience, I think what, maybe this was implicit, maybe this is explicit, what we really have to deal with, right, is at a much more fundamental level, when we do want to finally transition from the experience to the phenomena, and engage the empirical apparatus of understanding and explanation. Are we still challenged, right? And if so, how do we meet that? How do we meet that challenge? And I think the ultimate, as I said in my just opening comments, that the ultimate challenge seems to be this question of the real itself, and the problem of that pre-representational, I would call it, difference. Yep. that even as a scientist one has to encounter, which arrests the categories, and then sort of opens up a moment of creativity to produce that change, like a shift, potentially, right? But maybe another question here is, we're always looking for, the real, the treasure, the secret. But maybe the shift in perspective here is more radical in the sense of the Nietzschean embrace of a kind of a pre-Socratic Greek notion that there are no depths, that the surface is the depth, right? Yeah. Maybe there is nothing, right? Maybe there is nothing inside, as it were.
It's just mask and difference. That's it, right?
Yeah, so, and on that point, and I'm sort of struggling to articulate it, but on that point, I think the movie, and I think I might have mentioned this before to you, Nope, in a way, I think encodes this ultimate critique of representation when applied to the question of the UFO phenomenon. You're always kind of trying to trap it. We're always trying to capture this phenomenon. We're always trying to represent it, to photograph it, right? But at the end of the day, right at the end of the movie, it's just sort of these sort of sheets that fall down out of the sky, right? That there really is no big secret there, in a sense. Anyway, so I just a couple of thoughts. So I'll just turn it over to you.
Yeah, gosh, lots of really good stuff there, Mike. Kind of to the earlier comment, I like you made the point about, there's always this metaphysical framing of science, right? Definitely. But there's an interesting thing is that metaphysical framing of science is at the same time self-revisionary and on the fly, right? It has to be open to its own undoing, okay, in a way, right? At least that's kind of my like Salarzian take on it, right? Yeah. And whereas when we go though to like identifications at the level of the imaginal registry, and I say, oh, it's an angel, I'm not making a revisable, always on the fly claim there. Like I'm making identifications, right? And that's what I worry about, is that we help ourselves to identifications that are not themselves ideologically, psychoanalytically innocent, right? like as if calling it an angel really clarifies it, right, in a way that I'm not trying to pick on anyone's take, right, but like an angel, a flying saucer, whatever, right? Like these are themselves concepts that are in a lot of ways dogmatically grounded and are not open to revision on the fly and have histories, right? And I think until we get to the bottom of those histories, we can't really use those as identifications, right? Whereas, and I'm not trying to come out scientistically here, but I do think we have to have that critical willingness to revise concepts and maybe even admit that we don't have concepts for it. And maybe the game we're playing here is not identification. Maybe that's just not what we can do here. And that's what it is. That's what it would mean to get out of the symbolic and into the real, is to somehow realize we're not going to get water as H2O in this realm.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, or
what
maybe,
that looks like, I don't know. No one does.
Yeah, I mean, that's I mean, there's one problem here is that the category itself is needs refinement. I mean, UAP or UFOs even are very general categories that indicate the absence of an ability to identify in terms of an accepted range of explanatory, possibilities. It's a very general problem, right? And as we know, when you kind of dive into that empirical level, it's 95, 97% of these cases, in fact, are mistaken. I mean, it's error, it's misperception, it's hoax, or it's something that could be really attributed to the subject, to the witness, right? In just sort of conventional terms. That's not to say that doesn't produce, right? This is, I think, perhaps an important question or issue. That's not to say that a misidentified experience doesn't actually trigger, right, the kind of ontic sort of shift, right, and reorientation that typifies some of the UFO, sort of the popular UFO literature. For example, like I was struck by the launch of what later I discovered was Starlink, but I had never seen that before. That just arrested me and everybody else on the highway. We all came to a stop right there on the highway, right? And it was just this shocking moment. Now, had I never attempted to resolve that into something mundane, that perhaps would have stayed with me as a very ontologically or ontically significant event. That's not to say that experience isn't interesting and important in itself. It just so happens that in relation to the phenomenon, it was a mundane phenomenon that caused a rather supramundane transformation in me, right? And again, the experience is one thing, and the connection of that experience to the phenomenon is quite another. And some want to link those two things intrinsically, but what is the theoretical apparatus that allows us to make that intrinsic connection between the phenomenon and my experience, right? That sort of links it to something about the phenomenon itself. To me, I think this is one question that persists. But we don't know. I mean, so there's a whole range of phenomena that are categorized under here, and it's not clear that once you begin to differentiate what remains, whether that will be also able to be resolved empirically. In other words, we're not yet, it seems, at that point where science has actually come up against something that really does resist explanation, right? From the point of view of the experiences, they do seem to be bizarre and so on, and the reports tend to be bizarre, but it's not immediately clear, right, whether or not science can, in fact, in some sense of the word science, actually resolve it. When we start getting data in it exists within some kind of a measurement framework, right? It's not clear whether science can or cannot deal with it, or at least some subset of the phenomena. So, that empirical question seems to me, it's open, right? And we're trying to bring science to bear to the question, but right? It's a slow process. So Jim, I mean, in terms of this transition into a consideration of, you know, the empirical UAP instead of the experiential UAP, where do you see your thinking in those terms? Because I think you had said in somewhere that this text was kind of like one of perhaps a series of things, and that the next text was going to be more focused on epistemological questions. And can you kind of bring us there?
Yeah, so because in this text, you know, I kind of just punt on the epistemological question. I say, look, seems like there's enough claims that one would take it seriously. You know, it doesn't seem easily dismissed, and leave it at that. And I haven't done it, but I'm not aware of somebody philosophically who's gone at this thing like Hume goes at religion. You know, somebody like let's really carefully like dump this whole thing into Bayes' theorem and see what we get, right? I haven't done that, but I think it needs to be done, and that's something I've thought about doing next, right? And I do think, though, when you start getting into like, and I know this is like minefield territory, you start getting like to the disclosure stuff and all of that, right? So much of the evidence that we have, like you and me and all of us here as lay people have, in terms of the empirical evidence, is being mediated to us through the very sources that we also claim to have been like covering it up for 2 generations. So like there's this really sticky evidential problem that is like, as soon as you admit this is real at a nuts and bolts level, you got to say that there's been like a cover-up conspiracy, right? But then you also have to say you're beholden to the source of that cover-up to get the information about it, right? So like how do I ever come to like literally a Bayesian conclusion over of how to like weigh the background of what's reliable, what's unreliable in that realm, and that's one of the reasons why I haven't gotten around to doing it, because I don't even really know where to begin, right? Like how do we really come to a sense of what's reliable in this space where it's defined by a kind of epistemic unreliability?
Yeah, I mean, what are your priors? And,
yeah,
and how do you where does that come from, and how do you weight them? I mean,
my priors I've been lied to, and I'm asking the people that have been lying to me for information, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's why we should probably emphasize the necessity for there being some independent measure of the veracity and the evidential import of anyone's claim about the phenomenon. We don't have that. It's the problem. We have all we have are eyewitness reports, right, which are subject to the usual forensic indeterminacy, which doesn't help your priors, right? And it's different, right? When someone makes a claim about, the moon or an asteroid, or, Avi Loeb's, latest interpretation of an interstellar visitor, we do happen to have a framework, right, within which we can situate these phenomena and test the claims reasonably well. And that's why we can have, with Avi's claims, we can have about these interstellar objects, we can have, relatively secure, structured debate about the evidence and what hypotheses best fit that evidence. The problem is our evidence, right? It hasn't reached that sort of zeroth level of, okay, so we can assign these really good priors and then assume that going forward in order to measure the subsequent, inferences and claims we want to make, right? We don't, in a sense, we don't have that. All we have, and this is the problem that the UFO community often, will point out, which is true. We don't have that secure base of evidence aside from, testimony and so on in the forensic context. So it's hard to estimate what the priors would be.
And something important about, say, Avi Loeb's project is, it seemed that the evidence is trying to be gathered outside of, the institutions that it's claimed have been covering it. that's important. It's sort of like if suddenly the CIA came out and said, yeah, we lied to you, we did kill Kennedy, right?
Right.
But like, well, how can I possibly buy that then? I think that's this.
So that's the very organization which right.
Yeah. So
yeah, and
I don't think we can begin to like really weigh the empirical evidence until we have an independent body of evidence gathering.
Yeah, right. And that, generally speaking, that science, supplies that, and we can critique the place of science, right, in society, and maybe Michael Zimmerman, maybe to some extent, by invoking Heidegger, we might begin, to offer a critique of the importance and the place, of what is called technoscience, in modern, in the modern episteme, as it were, right? And we can have that discussion. But Jim, just going back to that point for a minute, right? With this, the disclosure thing, it's kind of a strange, it's a kind of a strange proposition. I mean, what's the end goal here, right? I mean, for the government to just sort of announce, yeah, we killed Kennedy, like that moment.
Yeah.
But why would we believe? That's the problem, right? So can you kind of bring us back to your Lacanian analysis of the big other and the function, of authorities in this sort of context of disclosure for a minute? Could kind of reframe the discussion back there, if you don't mind, in a critique of the kind of disclosure sort of.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a serious risk that disclosure movement might be this great example of Lacanian death drive in real time, right? Because what are we actually getting out of this? It's the constant defeat. It's that, like, what does Big Other do? Well, Big Other's kind of always doing this bait and switch. Like, if you just play by the rules of the game, you'll finally get what you want. But then you don't get what you want, which leaves you only more invested in the Big Other to deliver what you want, right? It's in that same, this is like Freud's example, going back to, beyond the pleasure principle, like you have that person who is constantly, complaining about like how their father traumatized them, and then treats everybody around them as if they're their father, right? And so what's going on, it seems like what you're getting out of this is the constant frustration, right? And there seems to be something with humans that likes this, okay? And this is one of the things the Big Other does in the Lacanian, framing of it is, the Big Other sets out rules, and we have to follow those if we have our desires met, or even know what our desires are. But then it's like in the Peanuts cartoon, Lucy always pulls the football out right before you kick it, but Charlie Brown always goes back to try to kick it. Why? He likes the defeat. It gets him, the closest he can get to what he wants is in the defeat in getting it, right? And this is pretty snotty, I know, but like when I look at the disclosure, like just this week, right? Was it some congresswoman was on Joe Rogan saying, I saw the evidence, but I can't tell you about it, right? And so like one more time, like you get the promise, but you don't get it. You get it, but you don't get it. You get it, but you don't get it. You get it, but you don't get it. It's the Lacanian death drive. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's and the history, I think, of the phenomenon, and demonstrates the same point over and over again. I mean, these sorts of claims are not unprecedented. It's been going on for many decades, right? And to break the cycle, in a sense, is to really, is science, in a sense. I mean, to kind of have some kind of independent measure, right, of the extent to which these claims are truthful. So Michael Zimmerman, so do you have any other questions or comments before we turn it over to just the general audience here?
I'd like to hear what other people
engage. Yeah.
I'm all for it.
Yeah, if there's any,
I don't
know if I can see.
Let's hear from some other people.
Yeah, I don't see any hands up, I don't think, unless I'm missing where that would be.
let me bring up a topic then. Oh, here's one.
We have,
Peter,
Peter. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Go for it, Peter.
Okay, great. Thanks. Awesome. Wonderful discussion. And just what Jim was saying, like, disclosure does feel like trying to get your traumatizing father to admit that he's wrong. You know, he's a narcissist is not going to do that, or something like that.
And he's just going to traumatize you when you ask, so why are you doing it?
Right, and you'll never get that answer. But I do want to push back a little bit on earlier the trauma framing, just to open up that there's another side to this. Like William James would speak of the noetic qualities and experience as illumination, not necessarily fracture. And I do hear a lot of, you know, one of my traumas working 30 years in academia was a lot of disciplinarians telling me how it is and not matching with my observations of the natural world and experience myself or others in different groups. So is it possible that this emphasis on trauma, like in ontological shock, just reflects sort of where we are in our science and realism, focus on the realism and the positive via positiva, not so much the negativa, and it's a stable, we like stability, right? And kind of trauma can be like breaking down that stability to realize, yeah, there were some problems there. But for those raised in, I'm thinking of my children or my children's children, like raised in a fractured and unstable world, the types of encounters are often like a confirmation or a renewal or even a homecoming of like what feels whole again. So that shift, I'm just thinking of like, and maybe the play between these two, like it's more quantum in that way of like, it's a movement between all of these things, not just one side or the other, but this noetic or positive experience is equally fundamental, rather than because the trauma also reminds me of the disease model of the world and so on. Like, yeah, we could keep pathologizing everything, but we will never get to wholeness if we do that. So that's one point. I've got a couple others, but
yeah, Peter, I like that a lot. Like this suggestion there that in a world where like the fundamental, like the ontological basic is, especially for like our kids' generation, is a traumatizing fracture, right? Like a, you know, a modulation as opposed to a disciplinary world. Like what might be most awakening would be like a sudden outbreak of stability, right? You know what I mean? Like suddenly something made sense. Like there was something that wasn't traumatizing, right? And I think that's a really important point, and a lot. I mean, just beyond this discussion, even, right? And what's that book by Han, The Burnout Society? I think he's making much a similar point there. But I think, and it's an important point in that. Okay, here I am, like this, you know, 51-year-old Gen X guy, right? Well, I got to understand, like, there's a baggage I'm bringing to this thing, right? And I need to put that into question, right? And like maybe like what I see as the important thing to read between the lines of these experiences could be completely off, right? Because I'm not like generationally lining up with the people who are having these experiences. This might speak to something that Michael raised earlier about, well, what happened to all the experiencers from the 60s and 70s? Why is that not happening now? Well, maybe it's happening, but it's not happening, like it's not being articulated in a vocabulary that's recognizable to like boomers and Gen Xers, right? And like whereas like what we're expecting here is like, oh my gosh, I saw this thing and it like, you know, it did terrible things to my body and it was traumatizing and things like that. Whereas maybe like another generation is experiencing the great interruption in the going daily ontology in terms of, oh my gosh, I saw something and it loved me for the first time, right? And that doesn't show up in what we're looking for because we're like, you know, maniacal Gen Xers, right? Yeah. I think it's a very, very good point. And I think there's also an important methodological point to be made there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, wonderful. And I have another question, if I may, unless there's someone else right now.
Go for it.
I saw a few days ago, earlier this week, there's a a journal article, or maybe it was a blog on Strauss's escape from Plato's cave. And as it was, oh, Jim Madden's going to speak, I'm going to read that.
Yeah.
And so it refers to this concept of the second cave. You know, once we kind of get out of the first cave, we're back into it. Like I think you were speaking to that in your first reading.
Okay.
Like, yeah, that we can't, the big, what'd you call it? The big other. Yeah. You know, it's like okay, we think we're out of the cave, but we've left some crude illusions behind, but we're still now trapped in more sophisticated, strong constructs. And even our own methodology or instrumentation, the instrumentalization is telling us what we can do next or what we can see next. We're always working on our little instruments, but we never kind of return back to that's a similar point about the AI. What's the value of the teacher or the college in the age of AI? Well, I think it's greatly like something about relationship. Like, what's your relationship to your teacher, and the attachment and the love, again, that you might feel in that, how we learn and what we're actually learning, rather than knowledge about the world outside, which I call the academic Tower of Babel. But, and not to be criticism, because I find those instruments very useful, but not for everything and not always. So that's why I like to emphasize the movement between, like, the instrument when it's appropriate, the diagnostic pathology when it's appropriate. Otherwise, leave it alone as something more, something else can come in to fill that feels much more human and relational and process oriented. So second cave. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I just found that this week, and it's Leo Strauss wrote a book, The City and Man, 1964. So I've just ordered that. I'm gonna explore that. Thanks.
I'm not a Straussian, but I agree with Strauss that Plato wasn't a Platonist, right? Like that there's this thing going on in those books, that there's a lot of trickery going on that Plato's doing. Like the example I always use is early on in the Republic, Plato tells you, hey, we're going to have to teach the young people good lies about the afterlife, so that they're on board with the political project. And then he ends the book with a myth about the afterlife. Gee, I don't know. Did he just let us know that he was bullshitting us the whole book? I think he did, right? At a certain level, right? And that's why I think like very few things in Plato can be taken literally. I think, and also like if you think of just using the example of the Republic, almost every character, by the time Plato wrote that, all the characters are dead, two of which were his brothers, one of which was his mentor, and very few of them died natural deaths. I mean, this whole thing ends in violence, right? So I mean, for Plato is deeply expressing a pessimism about the temporal world and our ability to get out of the cave, right? It ain't going to happen. These guys are all going to kill each other, right? So I agree with you. That Straussian thing is that outside the cave is just another cave, right? But some of the things you said there, Peter, really were moving. Okay, and I think you would dig Merleau-Ponty, okay, because Merleau-Ponty is a guy, he's saying there's no getting out of the cave, but that might be all the better, okay, because we're less tempted by narratives of dominance now, and we can find a kind of logos of the sensible world, the logos of the world, the images that we're in, that would allow us to be humane, right? So just maybe a reading recommendation there, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I've definitely enjoyed the chiasm as a formative concept.
Good. Yes,
I've read a little bit, but I'm not a philosopher, so I have to learn as I go. But I'm a natural philosophizing, which is the point of the essay, I think, in the second cave. But thanks so much for your responses. Amazing.
Cool.
Stephen Hall.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this angle that Michael Zimmerman talked about, this trauma, this pain. In Eastern spirituality, and I think in others as well, that seems to be a portal or a doorway to wisdom, to actually, learning the things that you can't learn simply by empirical feeling, touching science. But it does bring to question what we're dealing with when we deal with it. I'm thinking about Chris Bledsoe. Are you familiar with Chris Bledsoe and what happened with him? His encounter, he was in the deepest trauma, pain, sickness, and so on when he had his encounter. And then after that, he was healed of his illness. And now he actually invites people to come out to where he lives to see orbs and UFOs and all kinds of things. He's attracted people from the Pentagon, people from academia. He's just one example of many. And of course, I think that Diana Pasulka also talks about that as well. But I'm kind of caught in between. We have a situation like David Jacobs, who has written a book about the threat, where he has actually interviewed many people and hypnotized them. And he thinks that what has been done to them is terrible. And he thinks that people like John Mack, who was, a therapist, and so he treats them from that angle as a therapist. He thinks that John Mack doesn't take them far enough to see the horror of what actually has happened to them. On the other hand, we have Barbara Lamb, who has interviewed many experiencers as well, but all hers seem to come out feeling like they're special, and this is a positive thing. And I'm kind of caught between, what do we make of this? Is pain the window? Is the pain the portal to wisdom, to getting through this? And just one more thing. I don't know if you're familiar with Nick Redfern's book. It's called Final Events, and a group that was called the Collins Elite. This was a group that some time ago, see, Michael, I think he's familiar with it. The Collins Elite was a group of people from the Pentagon, from academia, I think from government, who had encountered entities and thought, wow, we really got some magical stuff here. We have things that we can either weaponize or we can prophetize or whatever. But part of the group felt that, wait a minute, these are demonic, these things that are happening, and we need to be very careful. And they went to a Jesuit priest who just happened to be the state director of one of the MUFON state directors, because they thought he might help them clarify, and they tried to give him just as little information as possible, because all this stuff is apparently highly secretive. And he was really unable to help them very much. They were trying to put it in religious terms as whether or not these things are demonic, whether or not they should invite them in or build a wall and keep them out. And so I guess my question, and I know Michael Zimmerman's going to want to answer this as well. But are you familiar with that? Are you familiar with the writing of David Jacobs and his book, The Thread, or Barbara Lamb's book, or the events of Chris Bledsoe?
Well,
see, Michael, I think you're muted.
I'm not sure you're addressing, but I wrote on the Society for UAP Studies blog a whole long entry on our ET's demonic in this dark sense, and I include reference to the final events. There are other research evidence that people have real concerns about this. But I want to go back to the what happened when Adam and Eve were chased out of the garden. Why can't they go back in? What stands in their way? Angels with flaming swords. Okay, that's what it says in the Bible. What does that mean? It's a price of re-entry into the garden experience. a death to whatever you were, re-entry, that costs you have to give it all up. I do want to come back. I mean, the great questions you're raising are real and interesting. The whole question of the gamut of standpoints people have developed about the meaning or significance of these critters or whoever these that are encountering us are about, what's if they have any. But important to keep in mind that our striving that we currently have to achieve godlike status through eclipse the human have honored and utilized, that we become lesser and significant in some way. By comparison, this goes back to Gunther Anders. To mind, I think I want to go back to Heidegger. Heidegger says that death is a sign of being. Now, what are we to make of that? It has something to do with finitude. It's only because of finitude that anything matters to us. What if you weren't mortal? You know, who's read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Do you remember this? If you read it, they have the super AI computer who's bored to death, right? Nothing matters. Right. It's immortal. Therefore, there's no poignancy to anything. To say that death is a shrine of being is that mortality and finitude are the conditions within which things can show themselves in various ways. And that the hyper quest for an ersatz reality, which would be mean living a long time, which has really nothing to do with eternity, is some kind of replacement, or some kind of, it's going to lead to some kind of satisfaction, rather than just a longer term dissatisfaction. And that the only satisfaction available is not in this life as we understand it. And I think that's these spiritual traditions. You have to discover a deeper truth in a discovery. But that's the way it is.
Well, that sort of puts it like a video game. You know, if you get killed and it's a little painful, you just reboot the system and you start over again. It's what the heck? Where's the problem there? So yes.
Right.
Okay. Let's see.
James, do you have a time for one more? Sorry.
Being in
Sorry,
time,
Michael.
as opposed to being in eternity. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. Unfortunately, we're kind of at the top of the hour, at a point where we have to begin to think about wrapping things up. Unfortunately, James, do you have? There's one more question in the queue. Do you have?
Let's do our next question.
Do you have time for one more? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So Eric Larson, you have the honor of the last question. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Eric Larson. My background is in the DoD and the DOE with engineering and technology, so I'm not nearly brave enough for philosophy. But I'm finishing up my graduate school at Arizona State University in global security. Wrote down a couple things here so I could keep my ideas concise. My thesis looks at how unprepared society is for real UAP disclosure, especially if some of what people are seeing is actually advanced classified technology. Vallee often points out that whether the phenomenon is real craft or not is secondary to its cultural, symbolic, and psychological effects. That's where it connects, where the UFO becomes this kind of hyperobject you can never fully pin down because it's filtered through secrecy, culture, and our own expectations. The way it's revealed to us is already shaped by the systems and technology around it. The core issue I see is the trust gap between the public and national security and how that mistrust actually becomes part of the phenomenon itself. So the question I keep coming back to is, if the phenomenon's meaning matters more than its material reality, what happens when that meaning is being curated, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by those controlling its secrecy?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Eric, I think this is a very good question, right? I've said a number of times that, let's say you've got two scenarios. It turns out we really have been repeatedly visited by extraterrestrial intelligences, since 1945, or it turns out we don't really know the history of the 20th century, and somebody's been sitting on like really groundbreaking technologies since that time period that would lead us to question, you know, why we even fought World War II or something like that. Like, what would be the more shocking thing? I actually think the idea that we just don't even know the history of our own technology would be the more shocking thing, right? Do you see that? And so I think the most important thing culturally about this is not, oh, it turns out that maybe, you know, some sort of other agency had something to do with the formation of religion or something like that. Like, human ideas have adjusted to that sort of thing in the past. I think the really important problem would be is if this comes out, if this somehow there is a there to all this, and it's been like covered up at that level of systematicity for nearly a century, that would be very, I think, destabilizing socially, politically, et cetera, right? So I think if I'm understanding your question right, I think you're correct that it's the possible like institutional deception is the most destabilizing, debasing thing that's in the play here. Yeah.
That's exactly the standpoint that I'm taking, and that regardless of if there's evidence for non-human intelligence, the destabilizing factor would be if this was something that had created so much mistrust over so many years that it would be a destabilizing factor.
And you're probably aware of this because you're registration on it, but there's a paper by a couple of political scientists, like one of them is Wendt. He was at Ohio State, and they made this point about the threat to sovereignty that the UFO would pose, and thereby it would have to be covered, okay? But yet at the same time, the very covering of it would be a threat to sovereignty if it ever came out, right? I'll try to remember the name of that paper. So if you reach out to me, I'll have it.
Sovereignty and the UFO.
That's what. There you go. Aptly named, right? Yeah.
But Jim, isn't your point though more deeply that moment of disclosure can or never will come, actually, because of the way that ideology functions and the sort of that structure. And this is to Eric's point, and this is a theoretical point. I mean, you know, maybe it's wrong, you know, but I mean, the theoretical point that I think you're making, right? If we apply, I know the book wasn't specifically about this, but we brought it to that point of disclosure is a ideologically impossible proposition.
Yes.
In fact, it's wrong thesis, actually. And
because if you're saying we're going to disclose something beyond the symbolic in the real, that it's not a linguistic possibility. Yeah.
Yeah. So right. So the point here is that in fact, the very proposition on the table within the disclosure movement is in a sense a psychoanalytic contradiction.
Yeah.
It's not even possible. Right. Yeah. And then you can draw your conclusions from that. It's not going to happen, at least in those terms, right? Within that frame. So, and to Eric's thesis, the extent to which
new
that
boss, it's the same as the old boss will always be the case.
Yeah, right. So this is the deeper sort of critical theory point to make there about that whole thing.
Well, thank you for the insight.
What if? Yeah, I mean, but what if, you know? Here's the other weird thing. But what if there is something to disclose? It's impossible within the ideological system that unfortunately is in play to be able to disclose it. So it's right, which is that's the kind of the strange, the paradox, if you will, of the system of epistemology within which we operate in the nation state, right? And that's kind of Wendt and Duval's point in that you're referencing the 2008 paper, right? The concept was ontological sovereignty, I believe, right? And that there was a structural reason why the state has to kind of forbid that kind of that acknowledgement of the operation of these of these things in the sky over which they cannot exert control.
The point is that the sovereignty is the state is granted sovereignty because it can defend against critters threatening the population. But this is why the Air Force never talks about UFOs, because it knows it does not control our airspace. And therefore, the whole legitimacy of the modern state is completely wide open at this point. So disclosure would reveal that the state is not performing its function, and therefore it loses its legitimacy. That's a big deal.
And at the recent meeting that I attended where Arrow was present, just kind of as a footnote here, it bears some thought as to why UAP Task Force evolved into something called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, in which UAP no longer appears. And it's precisely because of the recognition that UAP just serve as a signal of a domain awareness deficit. And the purpose of that office is not to scientifically study UFOs, but to scientifically engage the phenomenon just to the extent to which it is possible to close the domain awareness gap. That's what RO is about. And they're not hiding that. It's just that people misunderstand and don't understand this historical evolution. Okay, granted, it was only within the past few years, but the reason why UAP dropped from the title, it's very strategic, right? Because UAP signify this uncomfortable fact that the awareness of the domains over which the national security state are supposed to be charged with awareness and therefore protection is fails when it comes to UAP. Now it might turn out that UAP, right, are objects of unknown human origin, which is what a lot of the community that's turned their attention to the question empirically are interested in, but RO specifically is not concerned with that question, right? But interestingly, they are interested in, they are willing to engage the community, the scientific community, for that possibility, so that the science can be done that can sort of stabilize, our ability to close those domains, and then possibly would give us information or data relevant to UAP, right, more broadly. So that's interesting. And the society, by the way, we're producing an article based on our experiences and our engagement in this workshop that was conducted last week in Washington, D.C., which is where I was, and several other organizations were present, SCU and Newfork and so on. So we're going to be writing an in-depth article about that to kind of help correct the record and explain exactly what the function of RO actually is and how organizations might visibly and in a spirit of cooperation kind of engage the government, understanding the structural and ideological limits within which the government operates, right? There will be certain benefits possibly, but we have to understand, right, where are these structural ideological limits. Anyway, unfortunately, I think we should bring this to a close. Thank you very much, James. So much more to talk about, obviously. And Michael, thank you so much for your comments and your engagement with Jim. It's fascinating, a fascinating topic, multiple layers, from the unknown UAP to the manner in which we ideologically engage this phenomenon, both in the contemporary world and historically. So thank you so much. And Jim, we look forward to more writing on this topic from you. Hopefully we're going to see more books, more essays. So, and I'm looking forward personally to engaging with you as well, intellectually. So thank you so much again, everybody. And everybody, please, we've got a lot of stuff happening at the Society. So our newsletter is about to kick off. Our monthly newsletter is in preparation now. We'll be talking about our strategic research initiative called ARA Upward, where we're soliciting research proposals from scholars and those in the sciences. And we have our event, we have our reading circle going on. We've also got other colloquia in the works. In September, we have someone who is a scholar of Asian religions who will be joining us. We also have a number of intellectual other engagement opportunities. We have courses running now, actually, and in the future. So please go to our website to check out all the opportunities that there are. We're also planning for our annual conference in December, it looks like. So listen for an announcement on that date for our annual conference. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful.
Michael, could I make a quick correction of something that Dr. Madden said just before we go about Joe Rogan? So he was talking about the Anna Paulina Luna, who was on the Joe Rogan show. She is the one.
Sorry, guys, I lost my
by...
internet connection there. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
but I do have to run though, so I should go.
So Anna Paulina Luna is a congresswoman from Florida who was in a skiff. She's the one appointed through the president, by the way, to research and to open up some of these things that have been kept secret. And what she said is, yes, she did say that in the skiff, the things that they say have to be kept secret. But she did say she did see evidence. She saw pictures of craft. She said she did not see any bodies, but she was very clear. And she's the one who is going to head the upcoming congressional hearing early in September regarding whistleblowers who have kicked the tires and who have dealt physically, empirically with these things. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, thanks. But anyway, thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.